y'all might remember me as Mary. I'm not in costume today. Some of you also may know me as the Director of Outreach at Caring and Sharing of South Walton, our local food pantry and homeless outreach center. I'm also a Presbyterian minister, married to an Episcopal priest. My husband's the priest at Christ the King Episcopal Church, and it's a joy to be with y'all today. I always love coming to Simple Faith Church and enjoy my friendship with your pastor. So for our scripture reading today, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not going to do a monologue, but I want to reflect on, y'all know the story of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis? Well, if you don't, you're gonna know it after today. The challenge is, it's a story that spans almost 13 chapters of Genesis. Don't worry, we're not going to read all 13 chapters. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit at the beginning, kind of kick us off. I'm going to summarize the big middle, and then we're going to pick back up at kind of the climax of the story. But I encourage you to go back to Genesis, starting in chapter 37, and read the whole story, because it is an amazing story. And in a way, it's funny, God gave us a little parable, I think, this morning in worship, right? When something goes wrong, the sound box doesn't work, whether it's a little thing or a big thing, how do we explain it? How do we make sense of it in our own lives? And that's the question that Joseph was wrestling with. So let's listen now for God's word. Starting in Genesis chapter 37. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an immigrant alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brother, and he was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because he was the son of his old age, and had made him a long robe with sleeves, or sometimes we hear a coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all the other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably with him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf rose and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. When the opportunity presented itself, Joseph's brothers threw him into a pit, intending to kill him. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. The Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay, here's where we pick up with the heavily abridged summary of what happens next. So Joseph gets put in charge of his master's whole household. And then he gets falsely accused of assaulting Potiphar's wife. As you can imagine, as a slave, he does not get a hearing, much less a trial. He simply gets thrown into jail and forgotten. But after some time, he gets the chance to interpret the dreams of two prominent servants of Pharaoh, one of whom gets restored back into his position as chief cupbearer. In spite of promising to remember Joseph to the Pharaoh, the cupbearer forgets about him for 2 years. Until Pharaoh has a strange dream that no one seems to be able to interpret for him. And the cupbearer tells him about the Hebrew prisoner's dream interpreting skills, and Pharaoh brings Joseph out for questioning. Joseph, to his credit, claims that it is only God who can interpret dreams. But he tells Pharaoh that the dream is a warning that Egypt will have 7 good years of abundant harvest, followed by 7 terrible years of famine. Joseph recommends putting someone very wise in charge to store up lots of grain while the harvest is good, so that when the famine hits, people won't starve. So Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of pretty much everything in Egypt. Joseph, for his part, adopts an Egyptian name, gets married to an Egyptian woman, has 2 kids, and is living the good life. On the surface, he seems to have overcome his early trauma and hardship and have fully assimilated into his new country. It's a little bit of an American dream story, but set in Egypt. When the bad weather comes and the food starts to run out, it happens not just in Egypt, but also in the land where Joseph's family is from. People from all around come to buy food from the Egyptian prince, including Joseph's brothers. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And we learn that in spite of his recent good fortune, Joseph has not forgotten about the trauma of his past and the suffering he endured. I'd like to pause just for a moment to consider the situation of Joseph and his half-brothers. 13 years ago, they almost killed him, but instead sold him as a teenager to an international human trafficking ring where he would presumably be exploited, treated harshly, and enslaved for the rest of his life in a foreign country where he knew no one. Now, by an incredible turn of events, Joseph's half-brothers are bowing down to him, just as in his childhood dream, and he is in a position to issue a life or death verdict for them. The tables have turned, as they so often do in biblical narratives, and the last have become first. Here is his chance to get revenge. There's just one problem. Joseph's enemies are also his family. The lives of his half-brothers are tied up with the life of his father, who loved him extravagantly, if perhaps a little unwisely, and his younger brother, Benjamin, who had no part in the plot against Joseph. So far in Genesis, we've had a number of stories of brothers who had a hard time living peaceably together. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. This question about whether brothers and sisters can live in peace together is a central question of the book of Genesis, and perhaps today as well. At first, it doesn't seem like Joseph is particularly inclined to seek reconciliation. He accuses his half-brothers of being spies. When they claim to be honest men and admit to having 2 more brothers, one who is at home with his father and another who is no more, the irony is lost on neither Joseph nor the reader. Not realizing that Joseph, who has been speaking to them through an interpreter, can understand what they are saying, the brothers are more honest with one another. Surely we are being punished because of our brother, they say. We saw how distressed he was, how he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. Reuben answers them, "Didn't I tell you not to wrong the boy? But you wouldn't listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." Moved to tears that he conceals, Joseph gives them food to take home to their father, but holds Simeon hostage until the others return with their youngest brother, Benjamin, in order to prove their honesty. Perhaps he is also testing their willingness to again sacrifice one of their own for their own profit or convenience. Joseph also secretly returns their silver to their bags, another test. At first, Joseph's father, Jacob, refuses to part with his youngest son, but eventually the food runs out, and he relents and lets them go, with his son Judah promising to take responsibility for Benjamin's safe return. This time, Joseph releases Simeon and lets them purchase grain and depart, but again puts the money back in the sacks and puts his own silver cup, his divining cup, in Benjamin's. He sends a steward to follow them out of the city and search their sacks. The brothers, sure of their innocence, suggest death for anyone found guilty of the theft. When the cup is found in Benjamin's sack, the steward offers a milder punishment. Benjamin need not die, but must remain as a slave. Joseph has heard his brothers confess, at least to one another, the terrible thing they did to Joseph so many years ago, and acknowledge their accusation as a reckoning. But have they really repented? Or will they again give their father's new favorite up to be a slave? What costs are they willing now to bear to be their brother's keeper and chart a new path forward? But the brothers have changed. They tear their clothes and insist on returning with Benjamin to have an audience with Joseph. "What can we say?" Judah says. "How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who was found to have the cup." Then Judah goes on to explain how much suffering the loss of Benjamin would cause his father, who has already lost one son, and asks if he personally might take Benjamin's place as Joseph's slave. And here we return to the biblical text in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God has sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says Joseph, your son, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with them. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. "Here comes the dreamer," Joseph's brothers say when they see him in the distance, marching toward them in his fancy coat. Joseph may have been a dreamer, all right, but he wasn't exactly dreaming Martin Luther King Jr. kind of dreams. Young Joseph's dreams of everyone bowing down to him are not difficult for his family to interpret. "Do you intend to reign over us?" they ask incredulously. Even Joseph's doting father rebukes him. Not every dream should be encouraged. But it is not long before Joseph's dreams, the ones he shares with his family, and any more modest ones he may have had, dreams of having a family or herds of his own, even dreams he may have taken for granted, like being able to enjoy basic freedoms. All these dreams are dashed to pieces, twice. First, by his own brothers, for whom mercy looks like being thrown into a pit and then sold to human traffickers. Then, just when it seemed like maybe he could enjoy some success after all, even as a slave, as a captain of Pharaoh's guard, a slave to the captain of Pharaoh's guard, he's falsely accused of assault and immediately thrown into prison. I wouldn't be surprised if Joseph didn't want to have anything to do with dreams after that, his own or anyone else's. Every time he seemed to be getting some momentum, bam, another curveball, another setback. I bet some of you know what that's like, to have your whole trajectory interrupted with a call from the hospital or your child's school, with a hurricane or a pandemic or a betrayal from the person you trusted most. And it is not always clear where God is in those situations, what God is doing, if God is doing anything at all. I'll never forget, during the painful time of my parents' divorce, someone full of good intentions, an administrator at the seminary where I was a student, said to me, "It'll all work out for the best. It may not seem that way now, but you'll see, good will come out of it." If I hadn't been so shocked, I might have said or done something I regretted. Which is what makes Joseph's claim to his brothers in chapter 45 so remarkable to me. How can he claim that the evil and trauma he experienced was part of God's plan without sanctioning it? I recently came across a church of a friend of mine who, as part of their efforts to live more fully into Christ's call in Matthew 25, are doing a summer book study together on a book by Dolly Chu called A More Just Future: Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. Intrigued by its promise to marry social psychological research with anti-racism work, I decided to read it as well. In it, the author shares her dream of a country where people can be both patriotic and more honest about the terrible events in its history, particularly its history of slavery, land theft, and broken treaties with indigenous people, and the many discriminatory laws, attitudes, and practice that still have an impact today. Writing for an audience that might be inclined to resist or avoid such a reckoning, she tries to give us tools, research-based insights, and examples to help us move beyond that resistance and avoidance. After I listened to her book, I found it impossible not to think about the history and present divisions of our own country when reading about Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers, and particularly how he interprets his own traumatic history. In the very first chapter of her book, Dolly Chu invites us to consider the work of another scholar, Jonathan Jansen, who was the first black dean of education at the historically white University of Pretoria in South Africa, a country with its own traumatic history of European colonization, forced removals, disenfranchisement, discrimination, violence, and of course the all-white government's policy of segregation known as apartheid. As Jansen engaged with white South African students, their parents, and his colleagues as they dealt with the transition to a post-apartheid South Africa, he observed that when speaking about apartheid, three main narratives emerged. Some would claim that essentially nothing bad happened, denying that any unnecessary or unusual suffering, oppression, or injustice had occurred, or claiming that the net result overall was positive, so what's the big deal? Others would essentially say, okay, something bad happened, but can we just get over it? Downplaying the severity and continuing impact of apartheid. And finally, others, the ones who were most able to be successful in building new relationships, were the ones who were able to admit simply that terrible things happened. Chu notes how many Americans approach the darker parts of our own history with one of these same three attitudes. The first two narratives are tempting for anyone whose social identity feels threatened because they help to shield us from unwanted feelings of guilt and shame. And the more we identify as patriotic or proud American, the more our identity does feel threatened by the more negative aspects of our history. Unfortunately, thinking that nothing bad happened, or that something bad happened but get over it, it places us in a hostile and defensive posture, unable to engage constructively with those who were negatively impacted by those events we quite naturally wish to avoid thinking about. So what do we make of Joseph's statement? And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Does he mean that what his brothers did to him doesn't really matter because God was able to bring something good from it? One could read that as a claim that either nothing happened or that something happened, now just get over it. At first, I thought that the author of Genesis was encouraging us to adopt this kind of, Dolly Chu calls it whitewashed history, but in this case, I'm calling it power-washed history. Or, to use a theological term, cheap grace. Comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in The Cost of Discipleship. But upon further reflection, I've decided that it matters that the one making the claim, namely Joseph, is the one who suffered the most from the terrible thing that happened. Unlike his brothers, he is not from the group that caused the suffering, or whose identity as honest men or good sons or God-fearers might be threatened by revealing the full truth about the past. In fact, it seems to me that Joseph won't reveal himself or make this claim until after he is convinced that his brothers themselves have already embraced the terrible things happened version of history. Although they never come out and admit in great detail what they did to Joseph, like many South Africans did as part of the Truth and Reconciliation process, the brothers do reference it in a way that communicates their understanding that it was a terrible thing, with consequences both for Joseph and his father that still have impacts on all their lives. They also say that they feel responsible for for the terrible things and are ready to pay reparations even as far as becoming slaves themselves in order to avoid repeating history. Clearly, the author of Genesis hasn't read Dolly Chu's book, A More Just Future. But he seems to have intuitively grasped some of its insights. And one of those insights is that it is much easier for the brothers to engage emotionally with the suffering that may be about to happen if Benjamin is lost to their father than to focus on the suffering that they caused to Joseph in the past. By testing them and setting them up to be able to repeat their offense with the new favorite son, Benjamin, Joseph, whether consciously or unconsciously, closes the psychological distance between the past and the present and gives them another chance, a chance to choose differently, to change things, not in the past, but in the future. And they do. I don't know which is more miraculous and filled with God's grace, Joseph's generous interpretation of history and forgiveness, or Judah's declaration of their brother's collective guilt and then pleading to take Benjamin's place. Perhaps it is the demonstrated willingness of the brothers, and the one brother in particular, to model sacrificial love that finally enables Joseph to take off his own protective mask and make his bold theological claim. After so many years of dreams shattered, of interpreting the dreams of others, Joseph offers one last interpretation, not of a dream, but of his life up to that point. And his interpretation is not, hey, look at me, my dreams came true after all. Everyone is bowing down before me. As if everything in his life had been working toward his own acquisition of power. If that had been his claim, then God's purposeful activity claiming that would be offensive and would be against everything we know about who God is revealed to be in Jesus Christ. No, this is the radical claim that I hear Joseph making. God is more powerful than any sin or evil. And ultimately, God's purposes will not be thwarted. There was life after death for Joseph as part of God's dream, and there can be for his brothers as well. Joseph's childhood dream was to be bowed down to. God's dream was bread for the hungry and a promise kept. Children to bless all the families of the earth. God's dream involved lifting up the alien, the powerless, the despised, not for power's sake, but for peace and reconciliation among enemy nations and broken families. Maybe it's because God's dreams are so much bigger, so much better than Joseph's initial dreams, that he doesn't even acknowledge that his childhood dreams have, in a sense, come true. It is a bold claim to make that God is active in the world, that God is active in our lives, that God has the power to redeem. What about when famine arrives and no Joseph rises to save the people? What about when a hurricane devastates another community, or the cancer comes back, or so many young girls are still being promised love or work or security and instead sold into addiction and slavery? When the last attempt at IVF fails, or the baby dies inexplicably of SIDS, the last thing I want to do is claim that everything that happens is part of God's plan. And maybe that claim about God's providence in the midst of suffering can only be made by the one who is in the pit or on the other side. It is a fine line between claiming that God redeems suffering and that God causes it, and we dare not walk that line carelessly. And yet, like Dolly Chu, I find myself leaning again into paradox. I know that terrible things happened, continue to happen, and yet I also believe in a God who can make a way where it seems there is no way, who can hold us accountable and still take the broken threads of our terrible choices or misfortunes or inadequacies and weave them into something beautiful and good. Maybe a God-washed account of history does not have to be the same as a whitewashed account or a power-washed account. I believe that we can tell hard truths and still see God at work. The cross teaches me that. In fact, it is because of the cross that I believe in a God for whom reconciliation is not just possible, but the whole point. It may not be painless. It will likely involve a death of sorts, the death of selfish dreams, the death of the fable about our own innocence or honesty or goodness, the death of the illusion that we are in control. But the God we know in Jesus Christ goes with us into the pit, into humiliation and death, and then brings us with him transformed into new life, into reconciliation, into joyful and life-giving service, into a bigger and more diverse family than most of us can wrap our heads around. Whenever I threaten a consequence for bad behavior, my kids like to say, one more chance, Mom. And I always say back, you can't change the choice you already made, and it has consequences. But every minute is another chance to make a new choice. We do get one more chance, and one more after that, to listen differently, to invite someone to the table, to try again, to make a sacrifice, to say, I'm sorry, to be generous, to ask more questions, to be kind. But we would be remiss if we made it all about us, wouldn't we? In the end, our hope is in the ultimate triumph of God's dream, of the power of God in Jesus Christ to redeem us, to free us, to reconcile us, to heal us all. That's why we're here today, right? To be reminded of God's dream, peace, wholeness, shalom for all of creation. That's the dream we want to wake to and share with our brothers and sisters. The dream we want our time, energy, and resources to be in service to. The dream that transforms us as much as it does our surroundings, that can be a blessing to all the families of the earth. It's bigger than our personal dreams, bigger even than the American dream. So come again to the table. You whose eyes sparkle with dreams, and you who have all but given up. You who have much faith, and you who cry out, I believe, help my unbelief. This is the table where we remember whose we are and where we are remembered into family.